Hi, Todd Martin here. Thanks for joining me for this introduction of the Tai Chi Code. I've been focused most recently on the walking code, trying to help people move more confidently and more fluidly from their core in their day-to-day activities. Now I'm going to switch a little focus to the Tai Chi Code, showing you how to use those same core movements in Tai Chi, which is really where the code was developed from. Now, what is the Tai Chi Code and the walking code? Let me explain a little bit. I call it a code because a code is a sort of understanding of combinations that we need to unlock certain movements, like unlocking a safe. We need to know how to create the exact combination on the dial to open the lock. In the same way, what we're trying to do with the Tai Chi Code and the walking code is understand the exact combination of rotational movement from our core that is needed to unlock basic functional body movements. In the walking code, those applications are towards walking on flat ground, walking uphill, walking downhill, keeping proper alignment. In the Tai Chi Code, we're using the same core principles to unlock the movements of Tai Chi. For those of you who are looking for a little broader understanding of how to move from the core, and you've been working on the walking code for a while, studying the Tai Chi Code as cross-training I think is going to be really helpful for you to really understand how these movements work. Let me talk a little bit about the code itself and what I mean by the code. So we have three primary elements of our core: our waist muscles and our hip muscles, the muscles that move our hip joints. The waist is divided into two primary components. The upper part of the waist rotates our thoracic spine in the chest. The lower part of the waist, which we commonly refer to as our lower abs, works our lumbar spine and pelvic rotation. When I try to demonstrate this, I'm going to say we're going to use our upper waist muscles here. Let's say my right side upper abdominal external obliques, and I'm going to use it to turn the body. So I'm trying to isolate this motion to show you how this muscle here rotates the body. But I'm not really isolating it, because as long as we're standing on 2 feet and trying to maintain balance, we have to use all three elements of the core in combination at the same time. There's no way for me to isolate this one movement and demonstrate it without counterbalancing with these other two elements. What I mean by that is this waist rotation, so I'm demonstrating, you can see it turning, but that is only one plane that this upper abdominal muscle works in. If we were lying on the ground doing a sit-up, we would notice that this is going to flex our spine forward to do a sit-up. So there's a forward flexion in the sagittal plane from this muscle. There's also a rotational element in the transverse plane from this muscle, or the horizontal plane, and then there's also a component in the coronal plane from using this muscle. This same three-plane movement applies also to the movements of our lower abdominal muscles. Our lower abdominal muscles are going to tuck our lumbar spine, moving it in the sagittal plane. It's also going to rotate our lumbar spine in the horizontal plane. So my right lower abs are going to tuck my pelvis under and tuck the lumbar spine in a posterior direction in the sagittal plane. They're going to rotate toward that same side in the horizontal plane. So my lower abs on the right are going to pull back and turn my lumbar spine clockwise. My lower abs on the left are going to pull back and rotate my lumbar spine counterclockwise. The lower ab muscles rotate in the opposite direction from the upper abdominal muscles. My upper abdominal muscles on the right rotate the upper spine counterclockwise, and the upper abdominal muscles on the left rotate the upper spine clockwise. So if I look at the same side rotation, upper abs and lower abs, they rotate in a torsional manner, meaning they rotate in opposite directions. Upper abdominal muscles rotating away from that side, lower abdominal muscles rotating toward that side. And so I call that torsional rotation. We also have what I would call concordant rotation, where we want to rotate our upper abdominal muscles and lower abdominal muscles in the same direction. So if I rotate counterclockwise from the upper part of the waist, I'm going to rotate the lower part of the waist on the opposite side counterclockwise. And you can notice how by doing that simultaneous counterclockwise rotation of the upper abdominal muscles and the lower abdominal muscles, it caused me to collect my weight over to this side because I had two corresponding counterclockwise rotations bringing my spine from here to here. But it wasn't just the waist rotation, I also had to correlate that with a hip action. So what I did as I was rotating my upper and lower waist muscles was I was flexing my right hip. So that is hip flexion and that is hip extension. If I'm standing here on 2 feet, I can also demonstrate hip flexion would be this sort of action. When we combine all three elements at the same time, I'm going to flex my right hip, which is trying to pull it up, and I'm also going to turn my upper core and lower core counterclockwise, and that combined movement causes my weight to collect. Every movement that we do, and every movement you see me doing, has all three elements of the core working in coordination to perform that movement. As I'm shifting around here, I'm coordinating in a random way these three elements of the core. I'm not thinking about what I'm doing, but I am coordinating in some manner all three elements, and I am applying certain rules to that rotation to keep my body vertical. Even though I'm not thinking of the precise combination of movements that I'm doing, I know my intention is to keep the spine vertical as I do it. And the only way to keep the spine vertical is to apply certain rules of rotation to all three elements of the core. The rules are such: we need to move in a rotational manner, which I've already mentioned, but that means I can only use one side at a time, from my upper core, from my lower core, lower waist, and then from my hips. When I say one side at a time, I mean I can turn counterclockwise from the right upper abdominal muscles, or I can turn clockwise from the left upper abdominal muscles. If I try to activate both of them at the same time, what happens is I get an overflexion of the spine because there is a flexion component to each one of these movements, which I've already explained. When I rotate one at a time, I can stay vertical. When I rotate both at the same time, now they're rotating against each other, concentrating my weight in the middle and also exaggerating the forward flexion from the spine and causing me to lean over. I explain this in the walking code a lot. We tend to see people walk pitched over like this because they're failing to use rotation to move. They're using both sides of the upper core at the same time, causing the body to pitch forward. And so as long as I'm moving around in this manner, you know I'm moving in a rotational fashion, because breaking that rotational rule is going to affect the balance in a certain way that you will be able to see. If I apply this to the lumbar spine rotation from the lower abs tuck the pelvis like this. And as long as I am rotating on one side or another, meaning I'm rooting one leg or the other leg, because my lower ab rotation roots the leg to the ground. When I root my right leg using my right lower abs, I am moving around the axis of my right leg. As I do this, I'm keeping the root here. So I can't lift my right leg from the ground because my lower abs are turning back continuously on this side, pressing that leg into the ground. If I want to lift this leg, I have to switch to my left lower abs and release the right, allowing my right leg to free up from the ground. If I don't use rotation correctly with the lower abs, I'm going to get an over tucking of the pelvis. And even when I just did that motion there, I counterbalanced so I didn't fall over. If I just over tucked the pelvis without counterbalancing from the hip joints and from the upper part of the waist, what would happen is I would fall over like that. So we have to have this continuous rotation here. There are times where people use improper rotation from the lower abs and the upper abs. I mentioned pitching forward with walking from the upper abs. When people use the lower abs incorrectly and would otherwise pitch forward like this, what they do is counterbalance that by removing some of that forward rotation from the upper abs, and you end up with this sort of slouched posture. So you've got an exaggerated posterior pelvic tilt from the lower abs, and you have just removed the forward energy from the upper abs in order to keep your posture vertical, meaning you don't fall over, even though I'm not standing straight. The third component of the rotation is coming from our hip joints. And so some people confuse the lower part of the waist or back with the hips. The hip joints, what I'm referring to, are the muscles that flex our hip or extend the hip. The muscles also can abduct the hip or adduct the hip and rotate the hip externally or internally. But the motions that are the primary movers for the hip joint are flexion and extension. The other directions of hip movement and hip rotation are going to be a consequence of the combination of upper waist rotation, lower waist rotation, and hip flexion or extension. That's going to determine whether your hip abducts or adducts and how your hip rotates internally or externally. So we only have to focus on counterclockwise or clockwise rotation from the upper core, counterclockwise or clockwise rotation from the lower core, and then hip flexion or extension on either side. Because just like the rotation from the waist, we're only going to be actively using one hip at a time. Meaning, I would do this motion by extending my right hip, but I'm not also going to extend my left hip at the same time, because those would be pushing against each other, and you would not end up with rotation, you'd end up destabilizing your movement. I'm also not going to extend this hip actively and flex this hip actively, because that may be what this might look like. But if I extend my right hip in this motion and I also flex my left hip, it's going to destabilize the movement, just like what you saw there. So we have only one active hip at a time. When we combine our two directions of upper waist rotation, our two directions of lower waist rotation, and our hip flexion or extension on left or right, which means 4 different combinations of hip movement, we have a total of 16 different unique core movements or combinations. That is what I refer to as the code. Each one of those combinations is a unique part of the code, and there are only 8 specific combinations. Take the 16 that I mentioned, divide by mirror images, so divide by 2, you have 8 specific unique core movements, which I refer to as the core techniques. They also correlate very well with the 8 specific energies or postures of Tai Chi. 4 of the 8 energies are going to use hip extension. Those are ward off, shoulder strike, pluck, and push. and 4 of those combinations are going to use hip flexion. Those are press, split, elbow strike, and roll back. Those 8 specific energies are what we use all the time when we're moving. As I'm moving around here, I'm using some combination of those 8 energies. I've explained a lot about that in the walking code, but I use different names for each of the energies, since the martial arts applications as names don't really apply to walking technique, but they are indeed the same specific 8 energies. Let me show you how this works in terms of some movements that you might be familiar with in Tai Chi. Firstly, when I'm standing here on 2 feet in the opening of the form, or I could just be standing here on 2 feet prior to taking a step if I'm going to walk, I'm using the core technique of press. Press is going to be torsional rotation on one side of the core, and in this case I'm going to be using torsional rotation on the right side. My upper torso is turning counterclockwise, my lower torso is turning clockwise, and I have flexion of my right hip. It looks like I'm just standing in a static position, but in fact these parts of the core are actively moving. You can see press a little bit more clearly when we do the motion in grasp the sparrow's tail following roll back, and we rotate to this position, and now I use press, which is prior to push. So in this press, I'm going to be rotating the right upper core forward and counterclockwise. That's controlling my right hand. My right lower core is going to be rotating backwards and clockwise. So this energy from the lower core is actually what is rotating my pelvis backwards and applying backwards energy to the ground that is rooting my right leg. So as I shift forwards, my upper core is turning counterclockwise. My lower core is turning clockwise. And at the same time, I'm flexing my right hip, meaning I'm pulling my right hip forward as if I was trying to release it from the ground. But since I have energy rotating backwards from the lower waist, my leg cannot release from the ground. So what I end up with is a shift forward in my movement, which is press. If I take this waist rotation, which is going clockwise, pushing back off the ground, and I rotate it to the other side, now that's going to release my right leg from the ground. So you see how that works. This motion here, which is press, is the same motion here, which is press. What we'll also see in the Tai Chi core techniques are that each of the 8 energies is going to have a specific reaction with our knee joints and our ankle joints, and actually with our arms also, connecting our core through our internal reflexes to our limbs, upper limbs and lower limbs. And they work in very specific ways. When we do press on the right, we're going to associate that automatically, reflexively, with extension of my right knee and with dorsiflexion of my right ankle. So when I stand here in press, which in the walking code I call lift, because it lifts the body usually because of that extension of the knee, I'm standing here in press. Torsional rotation from the waist, flexion of my right hip, extension of my right knee, dorsiflexion of my right ankle. When I use press in any other activity, you're going to see the same actions. I just demonstrated press here, torsional rotation from the waist, flexion of my right hip, extension of my right knee, dorsiflexion of my right ankle. I can do another demonstration of press where we step out onto our shoulder width stance or our 3-line stance. We commonly do this in Tai Chi. as a step out. When I step out with press with my left leg, I'm using flexion of my left hip and torsional rotation on the left, meaning my upper part of the waist is turning clockwise, lower part of the waist is turning counterclockwise, and I have left hip flexion. My left leg is rooted to the ground because of that lower ab rotation. So if I was moving here, I'd be rotating around the axis of my left leg, not the axis of my right leg. So those are three specific movements of press that we can see. Our standing position with press on the right, our press in grasp the sparrow's tail with press on the right, and I'll use my right leg to step out. That is press on the right. As I demonstrate the 108 form in this video series, I'm going to go through each movement, stopping at the end of each movement that uses a particular core technique. So you'll know what that is. In the sidebar, you'll be able to see the description of the three elements of the core and how they're moving in each one of those techniques. And then later on, I'm going to do a full demonstration without the pauses in there so you can see how the flow works. If you do like this video and video series, make sure you click the like button, subscribe to the channel if you're not already a subscriber, and click on the bell to get notifications for my future videos.